Jim, let's just start with your message to Aucklanders on the back of what's a pretty damning report, and obviously on the back of what appeared to be a pretty chaotic January 27. What would you say to the ratepayers?
Nick, look, I think we have to acknowledge that our response on the evening of the 27th of January wasn't what we wanted it to be, certainly not what Aucklanders should expect of us. The report draws attention to a number of shortcomings in our response. It makes recommendations that we need to act on in order to be able to better respond, but to the extent that our response wasn't what it needed to be on the evening, I apologise for that. We have to do better.
What, in your own words, went wrong?
There are 17 recommendations in the report, but there are a couple of fundamental things. The first I would say is our ability to quickly assemble intelligence from across Auckland, recognising the extent and breadth of the impact, to quickly assemble information in a coherent way to better inform our decision making in real time wasn't what it needed to be. And that's one of the really important aspects of the report. One of the recommendations that we've got to work on is our ability to put that information together quickly to better inform our decision making and ultimately better enable us to communicate with Aucklanders in a much more real-time manner.
I guess the question is, though, these are all things that, we had a very serious rain event in 2021 that I think it would be fair to say Aucklanders would expect the council to have learnt from and to have in place should we have seen a repeat. And in this case, it was a repeat and a far more serious one. So why weren't those things in place under your watch?
Look, a number of those things were being worked on, it would be fair to say. But the reality is that the scale and magnitude of the event on the 27th of January was way beyond anything that we've experienced in Auckland in the last 12 years. And so our ability to deal with things at that scale on that Friday night certainly wasn't what it needed to be.
So there was on the night itself, the 27th, there was a period there where the emergency management Facebook page wasn't updated for, I believe it was 3 hours, a few hours. Also an issue where the first official press statement didn't go out from Auckland Emergency Management till 7:16 that night. How do you explain that?
Again, I go back to one of the fundamental recommendations of the report, and that is to work on our ability to quickly assemble a proper, integrated, coherent picture of what was happening right across Auckland in much closer to real time. One of the constraints in our ability to respond was the fact that we didn't have clear enough information. That's on us. We've got to fix that. There's no question about it. And as I say, I apologise to the extent that we weren't able to do that. But if we had, our Facebook information, our communications to Aucklanders would have been better and it would have been sooner.
The 3-hour black spot, though, that is after. It's clear at that stage what was going on in Auckland. I mean, you could go on social media, you could look at news channels. How do you explain inactivity for that long? I mean, was this a case of people not being where they were supposed to be? Do you have a handle on how that could occur? 3 hours where a medium where I think it would be fair to say now most Aucklanders would get their information from wasn't producing any.
Yeah, I think it'd be fair to say, Nick, that if the same event happened tonight, and let's hope it doesn't happen in Auckland for a long time, we would respond very differently, and we'd be much more active on social media channels as well as through the major news outlets. It was a failing on us on the night. We didn't communicate clearly enough or quickly enough, and that's on us.
You offered your resignation about 3 weeks after January 27. How much did the events of that night, the subsequent fallout, contribute to that?
Oh, not at all. I made that decision over Christmas and during January, and I hadn't had the opportunity to speak to the Mayor about it, and I was going to. But of course the events of the 27th and then the subsequent cyclone meant that wasn't an appropriate time to inform the governing body. Of course, though, having made that decision in January, I had to inform them as soon as I practically could.
So what has fed into that decision?
I've said all along that my reasons for resigning are personal reasons, and I'm going to stick with that.
There are a number of extracts or sentences in the report that talk about the relationship between the exec, between the Mayor's office, between various other parties. And when I say relationship, I mean on a communications front. What is your personal relationship with the Mayor like? Tell us about the nature of it.
Look, I've got a good professional working relationship with the Mayor. I meet with him frequently. He and I are in meetings together all the time, probably almost every day, and I meet with him one-on-one at least once a week and sometimes more often. There's nothing that would constrain the Mayor from talking to me or me to him. Our working relationship is a professional one.
There are no issues with it as far as you're concerned at all?
No.
What about the wider exec team and the wider mayoral office?
The wider executive team and the mayoral office are working well together. The Mayor's been in the office now for 6 months. His team is in the process of coming together. We're building good relationships with the mayoral office, and the working relationships are working well.
The report talks a lot about communication, obviously, and leadership. Do you have an understanding of why those things are so important in a crisis, and can you tell us about that?
Earlier and more effectively. We didn't meet those expectations on that Friday night. We know we've got to fix that, but we certainly understand that our obligation is to make sure that Aucklanders are well informed as soon as possible in order to be able to respond to the events such as we had on the 27th.
The report goes into the lack of information being provided to the Mayor and his office. But it also does talk about, to be fair, an expectation, I suppose you could say, that he be more proactive in seeking updates. Do you believe you were proactive in seeking the updates you should have?
Yeah, I think we were all a bit constrained by the coherent, integrated nature of the information we would have liked to have had. Can
we just stop there? What do you mean by constrained by the code?
Well, we didn't have a really clear understanding of what was going on in every part of Auckland during that event. The reality is, Nick, I think, we've become quite practiced over a long period of time in responding to events in a part of Auckland or in a localised event such as we had in 2021, or the Ranui floods, was an example. What we had on the 27th was much greater scale, much wider impact, and our systems, and by systems I mean flow of information and our ability to coherently put together that picture in real time, didn't work as effectively as we needed them to. Now, it's having that information available that informs decision making and informs communication. And so that's the starting point.
You sent a text to the Mayor on the afternoon of the 27th saying that the rain was, the nature of it was that the rain was expected to abate. What was the basis for that message?
That was the information that we had at the time. And, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say we would like to do things differently. Of course that's true. But the information that was available to us at the time, and the reason I sent that text to the Mayor was because that was what the forecasters had expected to happen. At 4:30 in the afternoon, there were still forecasts that didn't anticipate 245 millimetres of rain in the next 24 hours. We didn't know that was about to happen. We didn't know what was going to happen over the next 3 hours. I'm not saying we shouldn't have been prepared for it, but late in the afternoon we didn't have that information. We acted on the information that we had.
Even at that stage, though, it would have been just after, where there were pictures on the television, on social media of West Aucklanders literally, above nearly up to their shoulders in water. Is that not enough for the council to take a more active role in communicating, seeing those images?
Yeah, look, I'm not trying to defend our actions as being adequate or appropriate in any way. There were points of evidence, in different parts of Auckland, of flooding, but we didn't have a kind of a holistic view, if you like. And as I say, one of the key recommendations is that we improve our ability to put together information in real time that allows us to inform our decision making. We look back in hindsight and say we should have been able to do that, and you're right, of course we should have. To the extent that we weren't able to, or we didn't, I apologise for that.
Do you have you keep talking about a holistic view of the city as a whole and the situation across Auckland. Why was that missing, do you think?
Well, there's a number of recommendations in the report, and I think if we were to act on all of them, we would close many of the gaps that I think have been made apparent through the review of the event. You know, it's partly systems, it's partly about flow of information, it's partly about how we kind of put that information together from various sources in order to inform the way we act. You know, we were able to do it over a longer period of time, we just weren't able to do it in real enough time to inform the comms in the timescale that we needed. The
Mayor, as you will have seen in the days post 27th, there were a lot of questions around his visibility and around his whereabouts. We know that you made the decision to leave the office. Yeah. What do you have to say about that? How do you explain that decision?
So again, you know, I look back in hindsight, Nick, and of course, knowing what we now know, I wouldn't have left the office. But in that moment, what I knew was informed by what our emergency management team were able to put together. You know, as I say, one of the foundation recommendations in the report is about that. But I acted on what I knew at the time, firstly. Secondly, none of us knew what was going to happen over the next 3 or 4 hours. But once I was home, I was connected to our team, working through, you know, Teams calls as well as by phone. And so I was never disconnected from the situation, I just wasn't in the office. Of course, you know, we look back and say, well, would you have acted differently knowing what we now know? Of course I would have.
How often on that night were yourself, the rest of the exec, Auckland emergency management officials, the Mayor's office, how often were you actually in the same room receiving updates all at once?
Obviously I wasn't. One of my team, one of my direct reports who's accountable for Auckland emergency management was in the office. Did we have a war room situation effectively where everyone is in a centralised area, people are getting the updates all at once so everyone is on the same page? So the Mayor was in the office. The member of my team was in the office with the Mayor for most of the evening, but the emergency management function was operating in a largely sorry, I'm going to have to respond to that question again. My team member was in the office, and for most of the evening was in the Mayor's office. The Auckland emergency management function was operating largely in a virtual manner for most of Friday evening until we were able to get the resources together early on Saturday morning.
When you say in a virtual manner, what do you mean by that?
They were connected remotely using Teams and other conferencing mechanisms to work collaboratively but remotely.
So Auckland emergency management weren't actually all together in a centralised area?
No, they weren't on that Friday night for reasons, again, such as we've talked about.
Do you think that's, in hindsight, they should have been?
Nick, in hindsight, there's a lot of things I'd like to be different. But in hindsight, we know what happened. We weren't prepared for it. We've acknowledged that. In the report calls that out. We've acknowledged that, and we've said we're going to have to fix it.
You're saying that key members of the emergency management team were, in some cases, at home as well?
In some cases they were. They were all working, they were all connected, they were working virtually rather than in a room together.
Just lastly, you know, and we spoke about this at the top, but there's been a lot of discussion around the amalgamated Auckland Council's ability to cope with localised situations. We're really looking in hindsight now, but in terms of the process of amalgamation, what do you think it's done in terms of councils or emergency management, in this case's ability to respond to an event in, say, West Auckland or further south?
So civil defence has always been a function that was run centrally. It was run by the Auckland Regional Council before amalgamation. I think one of the call-outs in the report is that we need to look at how we can maximise the response capability of our local boards and community leaders without losing the effectiveness of centralised kind of oversight and communication and control. It's not one or the other, it's a combination of the two, and so that's one of the things we need to work on from the report.